All right, as promised, the next exclusive build will be this Wave SAFS Super Armored Fighting Suit, part of the Maschinen Krieger property. Now, if you've never built one of these assemblies, fairly easy. The fit of the parts is very good. It is a push-fit kit, although I would recommend gluing it to reinforce it. It uses a lot of polycaps, both for movement in some areas and in others just to facilitate assembly. The kit does come with a really, really nice decal sheet. Wave decals are some of the very nicest you're going to find. Now, the instructions would have you take this piece of shoulder armor and stick it right in here. It just snaps into place. And then you put this part and it goes over it. And then you snap the front on and you've got the upper body assembled. Now, the theory is that this part, this part is supposed to keep this from coming out because it allows this to move, and because the arm has movement, the arm can move up and down and the shoulder armor with it. Now, it may be that I'm just doing it wrong because I've never heard anybody else complain about this, but on the 3 or 4 that I've built prior to this, at some point in the construction, this little piece of shoulder armor pops off. And it can be, when this is back on top of it, it can be the devil to get that thing back up in there because these are not real strong parts. They're fairly flimsy. So what I do is I take my knife and I just scrape along on this edge and just kind of make a 45-degree angle like that. Trim this down a bit. And what that allows me to do is leave this off. And then when I'm done with the painting and the weathering and all of that, and I get the arm on there, I'll be able to slide this in, and by trimming that down just a little bit, this little part right here, just trimming it down just a little bit, I can get it to slide up in there underneath this part without any problem, and I glue it at the end. I don't leave it so that it can flop around. If you go by the instructions, they want you to take these this control looking thing, and it goes on the inside of the hatch. I like to leave them separate until I paint it, because even though this is going to snap down to it and cover up the detail, there is some ridges and some detail in there that I find it easier to paint without this on there. Then when I put it on there, it doesn't look like there's an area that I couldn't quite reach or couldn't get, the weathering effects or whatever I'm going to do. So I like to leave these two parts separate until after the painting. On this engine part, you'll put this on later on. You don't have to put it on. You can put it on after you've started your painting and weathering and all of that. If you want the whole thing to be rusted and worn and weathered the same way, then I would just say go ahead and assemble it. If you want this base part to be a little cleaner or a different texture or color or material, and then these parts to have different weathering, then of course leave these off, and you can get a slightly different look, but something to think about. Now, one of the things that goes on the top of the body is this periscope, and there's a base to it that's a single part, and then the top of the periscope, which is supposed to extend up, you can put it on a little rod and extend it up, is this 2-part thing. Now, there's a camera port on the front of it, and there's going to be a seam line running down it, and so it can be a real pain in the butt to try and get rid of that seam line with this little camera port there. However, someone pointed out to me that on some of the sprues, there are little parts right here. Let me refocus. If you'll note right here, there's these little circles. And what you can do is trim off that camera port from the front of the periscope, sand that smooth, and then carefully trim one of these off with your knife and glue it back on, and you've got a nice little periscope there. So that's a handy little thing that they put in there, but they don't document in the instructions. Now, I've glued this periscope piece together, and I've sliced off the little round periscope port and then sanded the front and the back and the top smooth so that I can glue on another one of those little ports. Now I'll just take my knife and put it flat against this piece and just carefully trim off this port right here. I'm going to have to do it off camera. Now once it's removed, I'll just put some glue right there on the front, and then I'll just take my little plastic piece and stick it right there. Now I need to position it off camera because I'm still a little shaky. Now here's some more just construction observations that you may or may not use in your own build. As you can see, I've been sanding this seam here, and the way I'm doing this is my strategy for this is based on how I want to finish it, and also partly on the parts themselves. For example, this right up here, I'm going to be texturing. So while I want to get that seam line sanded down fairly smooth so that there's no ghost seam, I'm not worried about making it disappear entirely. From here to here, I'm not too concerned about it because this piece is going to go over it. So that'll cover up that part of the seam line. Now right here, I've decided on this model, or at least I'm planning right now, to not texture this area. So I am going to need to clean that seam line up a little tighter than it is now because I don't want it to show. So I'll probably put in some super glue there and hit it with some accelerator and then sand that smooth. And you really have to pay attention. Where super glue shines is right here on these edges. Wherever there's a join, when it gets to the edge right there, that little section can be real difficult to clean up the seam on. So super glue is a really good way of putting that on there. And I just take a toothpick and I just put a bead of it along there and then touch the accelerator to it and let it dry and then sand it and then check if any bubbles form. And if they did, I do it again. But it'll yield a very smooth line. And then right here, there's going to be a little exhaust, but you're still going to be able to see some of this area. That's a little more difficult to get to. So what I did there was I went into the seam line and I just scribed in a panel line with this pin in the needle vise here, and I'll just treat that as a panel line and put a wash around it and do other stuff around it, and it'll just appear to be organic to the whole thing. Now on the side, there were 2 holes drilled out to allow a hose to run from the engine part here that's going to go on the back up to this little unit here that's glued onto the exterior there, and this will have a hose that goes to the arm where the gun is. I assume that the power for the gun comes from this area. Well, they want you to plug in this little hose here that will join this part to the engine, and test fitting showed that it fit just right. There was no problem with the fit. However, the edges of it are flat, so it looks kind of, it doesn't look like a hose. It looks like just a lump around there. Now maybe it could be that shape and it's protecting a hose on the inside, but I thought it might be more interesting to replace that. So I filled in these holes lightly with super glue, and there's still a little bit of a dimple there, but the texturing will take care of that. That's not a problem. But what I did was I got some lead soldering wire, and I put a toothpick in this round end that you see here, and then on the other end I just held it with my fingers and I twisted the toothpick around until I came up with this twisted metal wire. And what I'll do is, after I get the texturing done, I'll put this on the engine, or connect it to the engine, and then connect it to up here and glue that down with super glue. And I may put a couple of mounting brackets over it or something like that. But I thought that would be just a little more interesting. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'll leave these shoulder, and I'll actually leave the hip armor off too until towards the very end, just to make it easier to get to everything. They are oriented specifically. This one goes on this side and this one goes on this side. They're not symmetrical, so they can be swapped. And the way I make it easy for me to remember which one goes on which side is I like to scribe in a little arrow on one side, and it just lets me know that's the side that points forward, so I can get this one correctly oriented, and then of course the other one will go on the other side. So I do that on one of the shoulder armors and one of the hip armors, and it just makes it easy to keep track of things. On the back of the foot, there are these two little knobs, pegs, whatever you want to call it. What they're designed to be is if you drill holes in these and then drill some corresponding holes in the back of the lower leg, Canon would have two cable connectors going into the back of the leg or up underneath the leg from these 2 points. Now, it's up to you whether you do that. You can just ignore the cabling altogether, clip them off, sand it smooth, and ignore it altogether, or put in some cables with or without these little plugs. I'm probably just going to leave them in, put some cables in, and go with it. But that's what those two little points for. They don't show it in the instructions at all. But then if you look at many finished models and the way the originals were done, as I understand it, it had those two cables there. All right, at some point you're going to have to deal with the polycaps. And this is the most frustrating part of any of the Wave Maschinen Krieger kits I've built. They insist on using polycaps for the joints and for the hoses. And they could use plastic. They really could. These kits have such limited articulation, it's of almost no use. Plastic joints would make articulation possible, but then you could glue it in place. And the big problem you would not run into, well, two big problems. One, you could actually get stuff like primer to stick to it. You won't get paint to stick to this. You won't get primer to stick to this stuff. You can paint it, but you touch it, the stuff falls off. It is an exercise in frustration dealing with this stuff in that regard. The other regard is the mold seam lines that are on them are almost impossible to completely remove and get them smoothed out in a nice fashion. You can scrape it with a knife to get it off, but that knife scraping will leave some artifacts of the scraping process on there. You can try a traditional sanding stick. It's just going to laugh at it. A metal file will take off some on flat open areas, but it's not always real good in the crevices and things like that. I've seen Lincoln Wright demonstrate a method where he'll use a knife to scrape off some of the plastic and then use a lighter to actually burn off the excess. That works too, but I've not found anything in my own experience that completely cleans up the mold seam lines. So what I do is, my basic workflow is I work on the ones that I know are going to be more obviously visible, and I try and clean those up just a little bit, and the rest of them I leave as they are. All right, I've got everything as assembled as I'm going to get it in this video. A lot of times you'll see when people build Maschinen Krieger, they like to build it up completely and then paint it. I'm still, from my aircraft days, I guess, I still like having a lot of these components separate, just to make painting easier. I'll bring it together later in the build when I start the weathering so I can do it as one cohesive unit, but I just find it's easier for me to get at some of the details. Now, a few things to note. On the legs, they have these hoses that connect from the hip down to the knee area. I don't put those in, even though they're designed to be put in before you clip this little part on. What I do is I just trim the connector so that it's kind of pointy, I guess you'd say, and then I just slide that in later on towards the end of the build right before I paint it. And there's a way you can cut it, and I'll demonstrate this. There's a way you can cut it that it'll slide in and connect fine, but then it won't be able to pull out easily. So I wait to add those. Same way with this little hose that goes from the body to the arm. Off camera, I'll do, before the next episode, I'll do any sanding before the texturing is done. because I'm not really worried about getting the panel lines completely cleaned up. I just want the transition between them smooth. Once I texture over them, it'll hide everything under that. I did add a few little parts. There's on the SAFS, there is no fuel cap over here, and I like having a fuel cap, and so I was going to add just a traditional cap kind of thing to it. But I started looking through my spare Maschinen Krieger parts, and I found this from, I think it's the Vega build that I did, and I just thought this looked like some kind of quick connect fuel connector. I put a little piece of styrene rod right in the middle of it, and I'm just imagining this as being something that they take a fuel hose and just connect right up, and there's no need for a cap or anything like that, so it would speed the fueling process. And I thought it would be a great way to add some weathering and some leaking and some staining around it. I put a few bolts on the exterior surface. Again, these were from my Maschinen Krieger spares. One of the kits, again, I think it may have been that Vega, had on the sprues lots and lots of extra bolts. And so I made some use of those, not only with this large hexagonal bolt here, but some smaller ones here, and I covered up those holes right there. Just seemed like a nice random place to put that. And again, it's not lore, it's not part of the design, it's just something that I thought, hey, that'll give me a great place to put some rust and some weathering around it. So I thought I'd add those in to the mix. Well, I apologize that this video has gone a little longer than I like to do with these supporter exclusive builds, but I wanted to make sure I got all of the construction into this video, and the notes and observations that I thought would potentially be helpful, because the friends that I had in my aircraft building days who watched me transition to sci-fi, they saw how excited I got about it, and a lot of them said, hey, let me try some of this stuff. And more than a few of them have tried Maschinen Krieger, and more than a few of them have gotten a little bit into the build and just kind of put it away. And I know, everybody has their own preferences, and that's fine. But I wanted to, in this video, do something, and in this series, do something that will maybe address some of the common complaints that I've heard from those friends about building these models. And if you've not built one before, just maybe make it a little more approachable, and because for the most part they're an easy build, but there are a few things that can get really annoying, like these hoses. And also, I think just knowing some of the lore and the purpose and the reasons for some of these things can also help with the build. I know it helped me to know, okay, what's the setting, what's going on, what's the purpose, what are some style notes, what's canon, what's not. Not that you have to follow any of those things, but I think it just helps make a more pleasant build experience if you know those. So that's what I'm going to be concentrating a lot on in this build, is just trying to convey that information as I understand it. Well, thank you so much for being a supporter. This is a supporter exclusive video, so I'm grateful because if you're watching this, you are a supporter, and I'm very grateful that you have done so. So thank you very much. And in the next episode, I'll get to texturing and adding some further details and just see where it goes in the next one.